Did you know that you can inhale insulin? You sure can. And guess what? It's not new. It's been around since 2014. It's called Afrezza. But as the years go by, we keep learning more about it, how to use it, how to use it effectively, how to get the most out of it. And we're going to talk about all those things on this edition of the Taking Control of Your Diabetes podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Dr. Jeremy Pettus, and he is
Dr. Steve Edelman.
And we are both endocrinologists, both living with type 1 diabetes since we were 15, and we work at TCOID that Steve founded about 30 years ago in 17 days. We just celebrated our 30th anniversary. So on this topic, it's just Steve and I. So settle in. We're going to talk about Afrezza. And Steve and I have a long history with this medication. We, started, we got our first prescription in 2014 when it came out. We've kind of been on this journey of how to learn to dose it, the timing, all those kinds of things. But for you people that it's the first time hearing about it or you don't really know much about it, it's an inhaled insulin. We've done many videos about this at TCOID. And the benefits are not really that it's inhaled. It's nice to not have to give yourself an injection, I suppose. But the benefit really is how fast it is. Rapid onset, and it gets out of your system very, very quickly. We talk about all the time, insulin is so slow. Even our quote-unquote rapid-acting insulins, they take 30 minutes to start showing up in your bloodstream to do anything. They peak in about 2 hours. They hang around for 4 hours. That's not even close to what the beta cell that makes insulin naturally does. It can release insulin, get into your system in seconds. It gets out in minutes. Afrezza is much closer to that. So Afrezza actually peaks in about 15, 20 minutes, and then a little bit longer than that. But then it hangs around maybe 90 minutes max. So it really is kind of this like rapid on, rapid off. Perfect for bringing down those stubborn highs. You're hanging out a blood sugar of 250, can finally bring it down, get it on your business, or inhale it right when you eat. And it does work fast enough that you can actually take it a lot of times right when you eat. So it's a very convenient, very sharp tool for addressing particularly post-meal high blood sugars.
Yeah, that was a good review, Jeremy. And it's approved for both type 1 and type 2. In type 1s, it's anybody with type 1 out there talks about those sticky highs. Mm-hmm. Once your blood sugar gets up, you give yourself some more subcutaneous insulin, nothing happens, you give more, and then crash. And so, as you said, this insulin peaks so much faster and gets out of the system. I almost feel that getting out quickly is as beneficial as it starting to get in your system quickly because you avoid those delayed hypoglycemias, and it's much closer, not the same as a normal individual that secretes their insulin right into the bloodstream, but it's a lot better. And Jeremy, I think you and I have been promoting Afrezza for a long time because we use it, we like it, and I think now the tide is starting to turn when more and more people are using it. Physicians previously didn't know about it, and many still probably don't, but I think as the word gets out that this can really make a difference in diabetes control, it's going to be used more and more. I
would say humbly that outside of the company, you and I have done more for this drug than any two people on the face of this earth. We talk about it. It's underutilized. It's really effective, but it has been an interesting journey. So when it first came out, they really didn't know how to dose it, and so they said whatever you take for mealtime insulin, let's say you take 4 units of Humalog, it's a 1-to-1 conversion, so you would take 4 units of Afrezza. And, kind of the punchline here is we've learned you need to take probably like about twice as much, sometimes a little bit more. So instead of taking 4 units of Afrezza, you would need to take 8 units. And it's not that you're actually taking more insulin. It's just that they didn't have that conversion right. And that really shot them in the foot in terms of like launching the drug. And I'll tell a quick story because when it like literally first came out, Steve, and I think you prescribed it for me, and we had our fellows conference, which is a conference of we get the trainees around. We talk about diabetes cases, and Steve and I did our first inhalation of Afrezza in front of them to show them how you do it, how it works, things like that. And I took 4 units of Afrezza, and I ate half a sandwich, which would be kind of like the right dose for me for Humalog or Novolog. So I took my Afrezza, I ate my half a sandwich, and an hour or two later, my blood sugar was like 250, and I said, man, this stuff doesn't work. And I put it in a drawer for, honestly, like at least a year, maybe even longer, because I was like, this stuff doesn't work. And it wasn't that it didn't work. It's just that I didn't take the right dose. And that happens so often that, obviously, if you're off by a factor of 2, I should have taken 8 units. That's taken a long time to kind of figure that out, and we're finally there now.
Yeah, we'll talk about the timing as well, but as everyone on insulin knows, you should take your fast-acting insulin at least 20 minutes before, and if your blood sugar is elevated, even longer. And with Afrezza, because it works so fast, you take it at the time of the meal. But let's get back to the dose. The folks at MannKind did a couple studies, one of them called the INHALE-3 study, where they actually looked at what is the appropriate conversion from sub-Q insulin to inhaled insulin. And it turns out that 1 to 2 is just a starting point. So 1 unit of sub-Q insulin would be 2 units of Afrezza. But it turns out that many patients need 1 to 3 or 1 to 2.5, 1 to 3. So if you take 5 units of fast-acting insulin, you would take the closest thing to 15 units of inhaled insulin. We know the cartridges are 4, 8, and 12, so you just kind of get to the closest equivalent dose. And so it's really 1 to 3, Jeremy, when it turns. And you probably could realize that because you've used it yourself. And a lot of times when you and I always laugh about when the blood sugars start to come down, we educate our patients. When you see 2 arrows coming down after using Afrezza of a high blood sugar, don't worry. It's like exit stage left. All of a sudden, your arrows turn to one arrow diagonal, and then flat. So it's really quite an amazing drug. And I don't think I've gotten low on Afrezza, maybe once, in using it for many, many years. So it's really safe that way.
Yeah. So, and the company's going to the FDA to officially change their label.
Yep.
So right now it says 1 to 1. But I would say if you're starting, start with 1 to 2. Mm-hmm. That's kind of a good, safe starting conversion, and then you can go from there. And we're belaboring this because this is so important to maximize these benefits. You got to get the dose right, and it's like you said. We've all been there. Your blood sugars are 250. You take 2 units, nothing happens. You take 2 more units, nothing happens. I'm talking about, through your pump or whatever. And then you say, F it, you take your rage bolus, you take 10 units, and then guess what? You completely crash. The Afrezza comes down quickly, gets out of your system. There's really nothing like it. And then, liberating your diet. I always talk about acai bowls and these crazy high carb things that I would never dream about eating. And I don't eat them very much, even though you love to give me crap about my diet. But you have a tool that can actually fight kind of these high carb things like pasta, all
How about
those kind of
3
stuff.
donuts in 20 minutes in our donut challenge?
We used Afrezza. All right. So knowing the dose is so important. That 2 to 1 ratio is important to keep in your head. Number 2 is timing. And you're right. I would say the thing I spend the most time in clinic talking to patients about with regular insulin, subcutaneous insulin, is pre-bolusing. You got to take your insulin 20, 30 minutes before you eat because it takes that long to work. And if you don't do that, you're always going to kind of quote unquote lose against that food because you're going to spike. But people, it's difficult. They don't know how much they're going to eat. They don't like taking that full bolus. So it's a whole conversation. With Afrezza, the vast majority of the time, you can take it right when you eat. Now, if your blood sugars are high, above 180, you might want to wait, 10 minutes or something. So like a little bit of a pre-bolus. And if you're on the lower side, you can actually inhale it after you start eating, if you're in the 90s, something like that. So trial and error. But the idea here is that we finally have something that you could actually take right when you start eating, and it works. It's like kind of up to the fight in terms of how fast carbs are absorbed. That's how fast Afrezza is working.
Yeah, and because it gets out of your system so fast, depending on what you're eating, if you're eating a lot of protein or you're eating a lot of food, you might need what you and I like to call a follow-on dose. Call it a correction dose. And you can actually give a correction dose within 60 to 90 minutes of your first inhalation because it gets out of your system quickly. So that may be a normal finding or a normal correction dose that you may need depending on what you eat, how much you eat. And you can just do it pretty quickly, even if your blood sugar is in the pretty normal range.
Yeah, so we actually advise adamantly for people not to do that when they're on Humalog, Novolog. Wait 2 hours after your last bolus, see the effect. With Afrezza, it does get out of your system so quickly, so you can do these just kind of more frequent taps, Steve, that you do your best to get the initial dose right. And if your blood sugar start going up an hour or two later, you can take a little, 4 more units or whatever. So you can just kind of have, like I said, a sharper tool, more precise kind of control over your blood sugars.
I think sharper tool is a great word. I really like that, because if you look at the non-diabetic, their insulin goes right from the pancreas into the circulation, and it rapid on, rapid off. Afrezza is not quite that fast, but it's way closer to physiologic insulin than sub-Q insulin. The other thing I should mention, if we're talking about doses, that they clearly showed that if in these studies, if a person's blood sugar was over 140 at bedtime, they took a 4-unit cartridge. And it was, you think, oh my gosh, you're going to give insulin at night, you're not even eating. But because of the rapid on, rapid off, and above 140, it was super safe, and these patients woke up with a much better fasting blood sugar.
Yeah, that's awesome. The other kind of big picture comment I wanted to make about Afrezza is Steve kind of quickly mentioned that they come in these kind of blocks. You can get a 4-unit cartridge, an 8-unit cartridge, a 12-unit cartridge. So yes, you can't do your 1.67 units or whatever you can get through your pump. But I actually think there's an advantage there that it makes you think more big picture about what you're eating. So when I sit down to eat and I'm using Afrezza, it's less about how many exact carbs versus is this kind of small, medium, large? Is this a 4? Is this an 8? Is this a 12? And you kind of put it in those buckets. And I think you can do away with a little bit of the precision because the rapidity of the insulin is so quick. It kind of makes up for errors, if that makes sense. Yeah. So as long as you take something at the beginning and you can kind of like fine tune it, it makes it, again, a little bit more conceptual. And some people will say, they move away from units, 4, 8, 12s, to I just do a blue, a green, a yellow, so it kind of simplifies diabetes a little bit.
Yeah, I've always thought you were a concrete thinker like that. For you non-scientists out there, the medical phrase we use is pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics. And pharmacokinetics just shows how fast the insulin appears and disappears in the blood. And dynamics is how fast the glucose will come down with an inhalation of Afrezza. So it's quite a unique insulin, not only, like you said, in terms of the route of delivery, but it's really the time course of action makes it a very unique drug and closer to physiologic insulin secretion. It's a much sharper tool.
Yeah. So let's talk kind of globally about hypoglycemia next. So since the conception of Afrezza, what they've consistently shown is that people actually have less hypoglycemia, specifically what we call delayed hypoglycemia, after 2 to 4 hours after eating. Yep. And that makes sense, right? Because most of the Afrezza is out of your system, so you're kind of matching the insulin needs to when the carbs are coming better, rather than having this dose of Humalog or Novolog hang around for 4 or 5 hours and cause lows. That also pertains to exercise. There's kind of comments here on these notes that, if you're going to go exercise, what you want to do when you go into something that's going to lower your blood sugar, like exercise, is you want essentially no insulin on board. If you go for a cycle and you got 2 units on board, you're probably going to go low. So Afrezza can help with that because you could take it, a couple hours before you exercise, and you can be very confident that that's out of your system by then.
Yeah, and I think that makes life more convenient. You don't have to wait around. Mm-hmm. Nothing worse than a subcutaneous insulin on board before you go exercise.
Yeah.
And you want to, the muscles will just suck up the glucose in the blood due to the insulin around, and people will get low.
Yeah.
So that's very convenient, I think.
We all hate, I'm sure you've been there, Steve, where you kind of under bolus for, let's say, lunch or something because you're going to know you're going to exercise, and you go up to a blood sugar of 230, but then your exercise gets delayed and you're just kind of high the whole time. And then maybe you don't even end up exercising. You're like, my blood sugar was high for hours for no real reason. Just a kind of another tool in the toolkit of, hey, I could take some Afrezza, just, dress that lunch meal and then go exercise safely.
Yeah, well, I can tell everyone how I used it in the last 30 minutes. We did a filming this morning about foods that are good for you and foods that aren't good for you. So as part of the example of foods that are not good for you, we had a bowl of Trix cereal with milk. And to me, I couldn't just throw it out. It's just sacrilegious to waste Trix cereal. For those of you that are listening, it is my favorite cold cereal as a kid. I ate the whole bowl. I gave up the miniature Cobb salad I got from a local. And I was 247 with 2 arrows straight up. and I took 16 units, and so far I know that now I am 242 with trend arrow diagonal down. So.
And you just took that like 10 minutes ago. So like for something to turn the tide on like a super high, raging high like that is pretty impressive.
And I should have did it before I ate the tricks.
Yeah,
to be honest
ideally.
with you.
You should listen to this podcast. We've got all kinds of tips for you. All right. So speaking of tips for inhaling it, Steve, do you want to walk us through that?
Yeah. And you know what? There's a lot of talk about people's best way of taking it. The first thing for sure, you got to take it out of the fridge for 30 minutes. What I do when I go around town, I have a little Ziploc bag with some of the cartridges and each concentration, and I have it in a Ziploc bag, and so I keep those out for at least 2 weeks, and I use them, and they're good. I don't expose them to heat, but I make sure that I don't just take it out of the fridge and inhale it, because then you can get little clumps, and then that can increase your chances of coughing.
Yeah.
So that's number one.
Well, I will say, like, so the cartridges come in these little, what would you call those, Steve? Like you kind of punch them out of that plastic. So the official kind
cartridge
of like
holder, yeah.
expiration is that as long as they're in those little like punch things, you can have them out of the fridge for a week. And then once you punch them out of the cartridge, they're technically good for 3 days. But as Steve says, he carries them around in a sweaty plastic bag for 2 weeks, and they're still good.
That's my jock strap.
So, like, in kind of our practice, we find that these things are like, they don't really go bad, but that's kind of like what you might hear from your provider or your or the local rep, that kind of thing. So make sure they're not cold, because yes, if they clump, it feels like it gets stuck sometimes. It can make you cough. That's also something when people first start it, that's the main kind of quote unquote side effect, is that people cough. It is a powder. It feels like a little odd, a little irritating. So people tend to cough with initiation, but then you look over time, that goes down rapidly. So by the end of like generally 4 weeks or the first month, people are not, coughing as much. But I tell people to kind of expect it. And importantly, when you inhale and you do cough, you've gotten that dose. So sometimes people say, I coughed. Did I cough it up? Do I need to repeat the dose? No, it gets in the lungs quickly, and just, the cough, it is what it is.
Yeah, I think the other thing too is the inhalation, 2 to 3 seconds, kind of a brief like that.
Yeah, you don't have to act like you're going to blow a house down is the important thing. Like it's a kind of a gentle, smooth pull rather than like this huge, suck. And also, sometimes like a little bit of water before you inhale can help. Or if you do cough, actually water afterwards is also good. This says positioning the inhaler to the side of your mouth to reduce coughing. I've never heard that.
Neither did I.
Yeah.
And I think that, everyone's going to find the way that suits them. Some people never have a cough. I occasionally have a cough, but I think it's, you're supposed to, when you snap the inhaler, you tilt it down a little bit and about like that.
Yeah. Yeah. So you pop the cartridge into the inhaler, snap it down, inhale, and then you throw that cartridge away, and you're good for kind of the next time.
I should say the official recommendation is to change out your inhaler every 2 weeks.
Yeah.
Probably don't have to. And the other thing that came out of
Well, let me just say, because over time you can get a little of the powder stuck in kind of in the inhaler. So you can kind of tap it out, but like if you go like months with one inhaler, it can get like pseudo clogged, or I guess you could inhale it and get all that kind of residual. So just every 2 weeks is probably a good rule. To be honest, what I do is I have every prescription you get comes with like, I don't know, multiple of these inhalers. And by now I just have them all over the place.
Yeah.
Because some in my bag, some in the car, some in like my fridge, all that.
And you could tap it on a hard counter like this podcast table, and you see a lot of powder come out. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a good idea to do every once in a while too, especially if you're a frequent user. And I think, the side of the mouth, I'm not sure where that came from. And the water, I think that's a wives' tale, but I like to use bourbon.
Yeah, bourbon definitely helps. A little bourbon with codeine especially. Yeah.
Jeremy, before we go on, I just wanted to ask you a tiny step backwards in terms of the usage. What if you're on an insulin pump or a hybrid closed loop?
Yeah, so, in our clinical practice, Steve and I, we find that this works really well. So actually, Steve and I are both on a hybrid closed loop, different systems. And I think it works particularly well. Let's say you do it at the start of a meal. you just don't enter your carbs for that meal. So it kind of is like a wash. You're taking the Afrezza to battle these carbs, and the pump is kind of none the wiser, doesn't know that you're doing this. But the pump can help, especially let's say after the meal, your blood sugars start creeping up or down. The pump can then kind of adjust up or down to help. So I find that these actually work very well with hybrid closed loops. And along those lines, Steve, there's no wrong way to use Afrezza. I always tell people when they start, stay on whatever you're on. You're on a pump, you're on shots, whatever. Just have Afrezza, try it to correct a high blood sugar. Then maybe try it at the beginning of a meal. And a lot of people will just kind of stop there, use it kind of as needed for these unique situations. But a lot of other people will say, I love this, I want to do this for every meal, every correction, and you can do that. So it can be an addition, it can be a substitution, it can be anything along the way.
No, I think you're right. There's a lot of flexibility, and every one of these hybrid closed loop systems have a different algorithm, and I think they're all are in part based on the rate of change of glucose, and they make adjustments. So if you take Afrezza and your blood sugars start to drop after peaking, the automatic insulin delivery should adjust. And I would say this, that the better the algorithms get, probably the more specific of information we'll need to feed the system. For example, I use Loop. It's an open source AID system, and it has a choice. If you want to take Afrezza, you can put in. I just took 8 units of Afrezza, and it takes into account the rapid on, rapid off. So I think as we march along in the sophistication of these hybrid closed loops, using AI or whatever, we'll be able to input Afrezza. But like you said, I've never heard of any problems currently.
Yeah. Now the other kind of big news is that currently Afrezza is not approved for kids. Parents ask a lot of the times, but they've done a clinical trial, at least one, and the FDA is reviewing this right now. So it's possible that this could be approved for kids in the relatively near time frame, and that relates back to this dosing. Because a lot of times the other major thing I heard when this first came out is that 4 units is the smallest dose, and people would say, well, gosh, that's quite a big dose for me, especially for kids. That might be a pretty big dose. But with this conversion of 1 to 2 or 1 to 3, 4 units is more like 1 or 2 units. And so that makes it more accessible, I think, to more people, and help alleviate that fear that this initial dose is too big.
Yeah, I think people freak out when they hear 4 units.
Yeah.
And the other thing, too, is because of the rapid off, that should also make them feel a little more cautious. But like you said, it's always good to let people experiment when they first get their hands on Afrezza, get their blood sugar above 200 with a horizontal trend arrow, and take a hit and see what happens. And you can get an idea of how your body reacts to it.
Right. And that's something we haven't explicitly said. But if you do use Afrezza, really any insulin, you should be on a continuous glucose monitor. But I think particularly Afrezza, because it has such a unique, when it's kicking in, how much it's acting, all those things, you literally need to see it. So yes, you can be on a pump or MDI. I'm kind of indifferent to that, but you absolutely need to be on a CGM.
Yeah, and for you type 2s out there, if you're on a GLP-1 or a GLP-1/GIP, there's no issues with using it with those medications, because not everyone on these medications do not need insulin. Just depends where you're at in your history of type 2 diabetes. And so, yeah, I can't think of anything where you should not use it. We should mention, Jeremy, that if you are an active smoker or you have pretty reactive asthma or COPD, you should not be using Afrezza. And everyone needs to get their FEV1 incentive spirometry at baseline, at 6 months, and then yearly, which is a quick test, not full pulmonary function test. And
so I think the message there is that Afrezza does not cause lung problems. That's been studied for years now.
10 years.
However, if you have underlying asthma or an underlying condition, it can exacerbate it. So the reason that we do this quick, what Steve's calling an FEV1 spirometry, you just blow in this little tube, sees how much air you can force out in 1 second. So the test literally takes 1 second. Is really to get a baseline to make sure that you don't have some underlying condition that they didn't know about.
Yep.
And then technically, yes, you're supposed to do it at 6 months and 12 months and yearly, but that can definitely be done. But it does remind me that overall, Afrezza is not used, I think, as much as we would like it to be. So as a result, practitioners can be very maybe fearful of using it or dismissive. So I hear all the time that patients will say, hey, I went to my provider and said, should I try Afrezza? And they just have some throwaway comment like, no, it's not for you, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of that is driven because they don't know how to do the spirometry. They don't know how to educate patients on how to use Afrezza, because it is a lengthy conversation you might need to have with patients in a clinic room on how to start it. So if you do get resistance, you politely push back. You can find another provider. Sometimes insurance coverage can be difficult, but it's gotten a lot better, I would say, over the years. So it might be a little bit more of an uphill lift, certainly than just, continue on Humalog or Novolog or whatever it is. But generally, it's worth a fight. And I would say it's the rare patient that finds no utility at all. People usually come back with some story. I like it here, or I use it all the time, or something in between. But I can't think of a patient that comes back and says, I find no use for it.
Yeah, it's usually a frustration because their own primary care doctor wouldn't refill it or something like that. We should say something about prescribing it. You started to, but there are certain pharmacies that specialize in dealing with Afrezza, and they'll do the dreaded prior authorization for the healthcare professional. So without getting into the details, I do think it's important to know that. And you could look at the MannKind website. And the other thing is, I'm not sure if you know this, Jeremy, MannKind hired a whole group of people across the country as trainers. So they will actually teach you the ultra proper technique of taking Afrezza, because they want people to be successful.
And they can work directly with the patient, right?
Yeah.
So like this is
just like a pump trainer.
I was going to say somewhere between device and, medication, where, you can have, we can't train all of our patients on pumps. It takes hours. And this is kind of similar to that. So definitely utilize the companies. And I thought we were going to say about the prescriptions is that for the vast majority of people, there's a combo 4, 8, 12 box of Afrezza. So you can get some 4s, some 8s, some 12s. I always think that's a good place to start. And then a lot of times people come back to me and they're like, man, I got like a zillion 12s because I never use them. I only use the 4s and 8s. And then you can change the prescription to be 4s and 8s, or only 4s or only 8s, or whatever you need.
Yeah, no, that's important. There's a zillion different combinations.
Yeah.
But I think, you and I did a videotape on how to approach your healthcare professional when Afrezza may help you, but they are pushing back. And that it's funny, but it's also informative. And I say, be your own best advocate. You tell the physician that you want to try it. And if you can be nice about it and just say, I'd like to try it. I know it's a hassle to prescribe, but I'd like to try it. Mm-hmm. And then you try it. And I would say take advantage of the trainers. And the other suggestion is you can always mention to your healthcare professional that if they contacted the MannKind rep, they can give them tips and tricks on how to get it approved easily. Mm-hmm. But it's probably one of the most commonly turned down medication that we prescribe. And I think that has led to the lack of use that we've seen in the community.
Yeah. And again, it's definitely getting better. I would say for people, go to our website, tcoad.org, just type in Afrezza. And we've done a bunch of videos, a bunch of newsletters, we have, been talking about this for quite some time. Never done a podcast on it though. So I think people are hopefully left with, again, in diabetes, whether it's type 1, type 2, you got to get your system that works for you. Hopefully you can find a CGM, a pump, but Afrezza is kind of this other tool that a lot of people don't utilize, and it can be really effective. And beyond having a lower A1C or living longer and all those things, which are obviously important, I find Afrezza is really good with dealing with the frustration of diabetes. When you actually have something that can fix a blood sugar quickly, it can help you eat things maybe that you have been avoiding for years, and that goes a long way.
Such a sharp tool.
Such a sharp tool, buddy. Well, hope you guys enjoyed this podcast on just on very specific but very important topic. So please make sure to like, follow, share. Please take the time, 2 seconds to do that, because that really motivates us, keeps Steve and I going. We read all the comments that you guys send, and it is our currency to show people that people are listening to this and getting some value out of it. So Steve, as always, this has been fun. Thanks for watching if you're on YouTube. Thanks for listening if you're just on a podcast platform. And we will see and you will hear us on the next one.
Thanks, Jeremy.
Thanks, Steve.